elderly man saw an unknown girl leaving flowers on his son's grave. When he approached, she said, the sun had just begun its descent behind the trees, casting long shadows across the tranquil grounds of Maplewood Cemetery. George Sullivan stood in front of his son's grave, a simple stone adorned with faded flowers and a weathered inscription. He traced the letters of Michael's name with a trembling finger, the familiar ache in his chest swelling anew. It had been 5 years since the accident, and yet the pain felt as fresh as it had on that fateful day. "Why did you have to go, Michael?" George whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. He felt the weight of the world resting on his shoulders, the burden of guilt and regret heavy in his heart. He often came here, seeking solace among the memories that lingered in the air. But today felt different. Today, a strange sense of unease washed over him, as if the very ground beneath his feet was shifting. As George knelt down to place a fresh bouquet of daisies, Michael's favorite, at the foot of the grave, he caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. Turning slowly, he spotted a small figure standing a few yards away. A little girl, no older than 10, with tousled brown hair and bright green eyes. She was holding a handful of wildflowers, their colors vibrant against her simple dress. George frowned, wondering what a child was doing in a cemetery alone. The girl's gaze was fixed on a nearby grave, and George's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the name etched into the stone. It wasn't Michael's, but it was familiar. His mind raced, recalling the sorrowful story that accompanied it, a tragic accident that had taken a mother away far too soon. "Excuse me, are you all right?" George called out, his voice gentle, hoping not to startle her. The girl turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "I'm just leaving flowers for my mum," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "She's here." She pointed to the grave, her expression a mixture of sadness and reverence. George felt a pang of empathy wash over him. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely, stepping closer. "It's a beautiful tribute." The girl nodded, a faint smile flickering on her lips. "Thank you, I come here every week, I miss her a lot." Her gaze drifted back to the grave, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "What was her name?" George asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. He had never met her before, but there was something about her that felt achingly familiar. "Emily," she replied softly. "Emily Thompson." George's heart sank. He remembered the Thompsons from the town. They had been neighbors for years. David, Emily's father, was a mechanic, a hard-working man who had always been friendly but quiet. He had overheard whispers about the accident that had taken Emily's mother, and he had felt a surge of sorrow for the family. "Emily," he repeated, letting the name linger on his tongue. "I'm George. I used to know your mum. She was a lovely woman." The little girl's face lit up with a hint of recognition. "You knew her? Really?" "Yes, she was very kind, always had a smile on her face." George's voice faltered, the memories flooding back. Of evenings spent chatting over the fence, of shared laughter and community gatherings. "Do you come here often?" Emily asked, her curious eyes studying him with a mix of innocence and understanding beyond her years. "Every week," George admitted. "I visit my son." He gestured toward Michael's grave, feeling the familiar wave of sorrow wash over him. He passed away a while ago." "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard, isn't it?" George nodded, his throat tightening. "It is, but coming here helps sometimes." He looked down at the daisies he had brought, their bright petals contrasting against the gray of the stone. Emily knelt beside her mother's grave, carefully placing the wildflowers next to the headstone. "I wish I could talk to her," she said, her small hands trembling slightly as she brushed her fingers across the engraved name. "I just want to tell her I love her." George felt a lump form in his throat. He understood that longing all too well. "You can talk to her, you know," he said softly. "She can hear you. In your heart, she'll always be with you." Emily looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Do you think so?" "I know so," George replied, feeling a warmth spreading through him. "Love doesn't disappear. It stays with us, even when they're gone." For a moment, they shared a silence, united in their grief. George felt a connection he hadn't expected, a bond forged through shared pain and loss. "Can I leave flowers for your son?" Emily asked suddenly, her expression earnest. George blinked in surprise. "You want to?" "Yeah," she said, nodding vigorously. "He should have flowers too." The gesture touched George deeply. "That would mean a lot to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Emily picked a few of the wildflowers from her bouquet and placed them gently at the foot of Michael's grave. "There. Now he has flowers too." George smiled through his tears. He would have liked that. As they stood together in the fading light, George felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Perhaps this unexpected friendship could help mend the cracks in their hearts, a shared journey of healing amidst the shadows of their pasts. But beneath the surface of their newfound connection, a nagging thought lingered in George's mind. The name on Michael's grave, the one Emily had mentioned, there was something unsettling about it, a whisper of uncertainty that tugged at him. He pushed the thought aside for now, focusing instead on the girl beside him. "Would you like to share some stories about our families?" George suggested, desperate to keep the conversation flowing, to distract himself from the doubts that were beginning to creep in. "Sure," Emily said, her smile wide once again. "I'd love to hear about your son." As they began to talk, exchanging laughter and stories, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving them in the gentle embrace of twilight. Little did George know that this encounter was merely the beginning of a journey that would unravel secrets long buried and challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the ties that bind. The following week, George found himself returning to Maplewood Cemetery with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The encounter with Emily had stirred something deep within him, a spark of connection that he had not felt in years. As he walked the familiar path to Michael's grave, he felt a warmth in the air, the sun casting golden rays through the trees, illuminating the vibrant wildflowers that danced in the gentle breeze. However, the weight of his thoughts lingered. The name on the grave. What was it that Emily had said? Michael's name was not the only one etched into the stones of Maplewood. With each step, his mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories and whispers of the past. When he reached Michael's grave, a sense of calm washed over him, yet the nagging thought remained. He knelt down, placing a new bouquet of daisies alongside the old ones, and whispered, "I miss you, son. I wish I could make sense of all this." "Mr. Sullivan?" A voice broke through his reverie. George looked up to see David Thompson approaching, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. The mechanic's strong frame seemed to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders, just as George felt his own burdens pressing down. "David," George replied, standing up to greet him, "what brings you here?" "I saw you from my shop," David said, glancing around before his eyes settled on Michael's grave. "I thought I might find you here. Emily mentioned meeting someone special last week. I didn't know it was you." George felt a rush of warmth at the mention of Emily. "Yes, we met. She's a remarkable girl, full of spirit despite everything she's been through." David nodded, his brow furrowing. "I worry about her. Since the accident, it's been hard on both of us. She puts on a brave face, but I can see the hurt in her eyes." "I understand," George said, feeling a kinship with David. "It's similar for me. Losing Michael, it's like a piece of me is missing." They shared a moment of silence, the weight of their losses hanging in the air. Then George took a deep breath, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "David, there's something I need to ask you." "What is it?" David replied, his brows raised in curiosity. "It's about the accident that took Emily's mother. I can't help but wonder if there's more to the story than what we know." George's heart raced as he spoke, the fear of dredging up old wounds battling with the need for answers. David's expression shifted, the lines of worry deepening on his forehead. "What do you mean?" "Emily mentioned her mother's grave last week, and it made me think about the names buried in this cemetery. I've heard whispers about that night, how it all happened. It feels like there are pieces missing." David shifted uneasily, his gaze drifting away as he contemplated George's words. "I've tried to piece it together myself, but it's like chasing shadows. All I know is that Emily's mother was driving home late that night. It was a foggy evening and it was hard to see anything." George nodded, recalling the reports he had heard about the accident. I remember it well. It was a tragedy for everyone in Maplewood. But what if... He hesitated, unsure of how to voice his suspicions. What if there was a mistake? What if the body buried in Emily's mother's grave isn't hers? David's eyes widened, a flicker of realization crossing his face. Are you suggesting a body swap? That's a horrifying thought, George. I know it sounds far-fetched, George said, his voice low, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something more. Emily's name was familiar to me even before I met her. I can't help but wonder if we're all connected in ways we don't yet understand. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been so focused on trying to keep Emily safe and happy that I didn't even think about the implications of it all. But if there's even a hint of truth to what you're saying, we owe it to ourselves to find out. Together, George asked, his heart racing at the thought of joining forces with David. They were both grieving fathers, both navigating the murky waters of loss. Perhaps they could find answers together. Together, David agreed, determination filling his voice. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my daughter and uncover the truth. We should start with Henry. He's been the director of the cemetery for years and might have some insights into the records. George felt a surge of hope. Yes, let's go see him. If anyone can help us, it's Henry. As they made their way out of the cemetery, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was thick with possibility, a sense of urgency propelling them forward. They drove to the cemetery office, the familiar building standing stoic against the backdrop of the setting sun. George's heart raced as they entered, the smell of aged wood and dust filling the air. Henry Adams was seated at his desk, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Henry," George called out, drawing the director's attention, "we need to talk. It's important." Henry looked up, his serious demeanor shifting to one of concern. "What's going on, George?" "We have questions about the records," David interjected, his voice steady. "About the accident that claimed Emily's mother and possibly even more." A flicker of recognition crossed Henry's face, followed by an expression of worry. "I see. Sit down, both of you. This sounds serious." As they settled into the chairs across from Henry, George felt the weight of their shared trauma pressing down on them. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the conversation unfolded, George knew that the journey ahead would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, love, and the bonds that tied their lives together in ways they were only beginning to understand. The air in the cemetery office felt thick with anticipation as George and David sat across from Henry Adams. The director's desk was cluttered with aged files and dusty ledgers, remnants of a history that seemed to whisper secrets just out of earshot. George's heart raced as he prepared to confront the shadows of the past, the questions that had gnawed at him since meeting Emily. "Thank you for meeting us, Henry," George said, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "We need your help. It's about the records of the graves here, particularly those related to the accident that took Emily's mother." Henry nodded, his expression serious. "I've been in charge of this cemetery for over 20 years. I know every grave and every story that comes with it, but I can't recall the details of that specific night without looking through the records." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "What exactly are you two suggesting?" David took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "We are concerned that there might have been a mistake. Emily mentioned her mother's grave, and it made George and me question whether the body buried there is actually hers." Henry's brow furrowed as he considered their words. "That's a serious accusation. Are you suggesting a body swap?" "It sounds wild, I know," George interjected, feeling the weight of their shared grief pressing heavily on him. "But there's a connection between our losses that we can't ignore. We owe it to ourselves to investigate." Henry leaned forward, intrigued yet cautious. "If you believe there's any truth to this, we should start by looking at the records. I'll warn you, though, some things are better left buried." George felt a chill run down his spine at Henry's words. "We need to know, Henry, for Emily's sake, and for my own peace of mind." With a resigned sigh, Henry rose from his chair and walked over to a filing cabinet tucked away in the corner of the room. He rummaged through the drawers, pulling out yellowed papers and faded documents, their edges frayed with age. "I'll show you what I can, but remember there are families involved. This isn't just a matter of names on a page." "Understood," David replied, his voice firm. "But Emily deserves to know the truth about her mother. We all do." Henry returned to the desk, laying out several documents before them. "This is the record from the night of the accident. It was a foggy evening, as you know, and the police reports indicate that the driver lost control on the highway. Emily's mother was pronounced dead at the scene." As George scanned the pages, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. The words seemed to dance before his eyes, blurring together. He could almost hear Michael's laughter echoing in his mind, a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. "Is there anything unusual in the records?" David asked, glancing at George, who nodded in silent agreement. Henry flipped through the documents, his brows furrowing deeper. "There are no notes indicating any discrepancies. However—" He paused, his fingers hesitating over a particular page. "There is a mention of a missing body identification tag." "What does that mean?" George asked, his pulse quickening. "It means that when the body was taken to the morgue, the tag that usually identifies the deceased was either lost or never attached. It's a protocol that was missed, and it raises questions about the body that was buried." David's face paled. "So you're saying there's a chance that the body in Emily's mother's grave might not be hers?" "I can't say for certain," Henry replied, his tone grave. "But it's a possibility we can't ignore. If you're serious about this, you'll need to dig deeper. I can help you access the morgue records, but I'll need to speak with the coroner first." "Please do whatever it takes," George urged, his voice thick with emotion. "This could change everything for Emily." Henry nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll make some calls. In the meantime, I suggest you two prepare yourselves for whatever you might uncover. This won't be easy." As they left the office, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery into shadows. George's heart felt heavy, a mixture of hope and fear coursing through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something monumental, a truth that could either heal or shatter their already fragile lives. "Do you really think there's a chance?" David asked as they walked to the parking lot, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," George admitted, his thoughts swirling. "But if there's even a hint of truth to what we're suspecting, we can't ignore it. For Emily's sake, for both of our sakes." David sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I just want to protect her. She's been through so much already. I don't want to add to her pain." George placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "We're doing this for her. We're seeking answers, and if the truth is painful, it's still better than living in uncertainty." As they drove through the quiet streets of Maplewood, George's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Memories of Michael mingled with the image of Emily's bright green eyes, filled with hope and sadness. They were all intertwined in a web of loss, and he couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets lay buried beneath the surface. The next day, George and David met again, this time at the local diner, a cozy spot filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the chatter of townsfolk. They chose a booth in the corner, determined to strategize their next steps. "Henry said he'd get in touch with the coroner," George said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "But we shouldn't wait. We need to talk to Emily. She deserves to hear this from us, no matter how difficult it may be." David nodded, his expression somber. "You're right. If we're going to uncover the truth, she should be part of it." As they sat in silence, contemplating the weight of their decision, George felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Together, they would face the storm, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to heal the wounds that bound them all. With resolve solidifying in their hearts, they finished their coffee and prepared to face the truth that awaited them. The journey ahead would be challenging, but they had each other, and for now that was enough. The following day dawned grey and overcast, the kind of day that felt heavy with unspoken truths. George Sullivan stood on the porch of his old house, the familiar creaks of the wooden steps echoing around him as he prepared for a conversation that weighed heavily on his heart. He had spent the previous night tossing and turning, the implications of their investigation swirling in his mind like a restless storm. "Emily deserves to know," he murmured to himself, gripping the railing tightly as he scanned the quiet street. The Thompsons lived just a few blocks away, their house a modest structure adorned with colorful flowers that David had likely planted in a feeble attempt to bring some brightness into their lives. Today, they would face the truth together. After a quick breakfast, George made his way to the Thompson residence, the air thick with anticipation. As he approached the front door, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He knocked softly, his heart racing as he waited. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing David, his face drawn with worry. "George," David said, stepping aside to let him in, "you're early." "I thought it best to come before Emily got too engrossed in her day," George replied, trying to maintain a calm facade. "We need to talk." "I know," David said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about it all night. I just hope she can handle it." They made their way to the small living room where family photos adorned the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, reminders of happier days. Emily's laughter echoed in George's mind as he remembered their brief encounter in the cemetery. The little girl deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Let's sit down," George suggested, gesturing to the worn couch. David nodded and they both took a seat, the air thick with tension. "Do you think she'll understand?" David asked, his eyes clouded with concern. "Kids are resilient," George replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "She might surprise us." Just then, Emily bounded into the room, her hair bouncing with each step. "Daddy, Mr. Sullivan," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with innocence. "What are you two talking about?" David exchanged a glance with George, a silent agreement passing between them. "Emily, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "we need to talk to you about something important." Emily's smile faded slightly, her brows furrowing in confusion. "Is it about Mommy?" George's heart sank at the mention of the little girl's mother. "Yes, it is," he said softly. "But it's complicated, and we want you to know the whole story." "Okay," Emily replied, her voice small as she settled down on the floor in front of them. "I'm listening." George took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Emily, do you remember the day you and I met at the cemetery?" She nodded, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You were sad. I was sad too." "Right," George continued, his voice trembling slightly. "We both have had to deal with a lot of sadness. I lost my son, Michael, and you lost your mother. It's something that connects us." Emily's expression turned serious. "I miss my mom every day." "I know," David said softly, his voice filled with compassion. "And that's why we need to talk about the truth surrounding what happened." The little girl tilted her head, her brow furrowing as she tried to process their words. "What do you mean?" George exchanged another glance with David, who nodded, urging him to continue. "There are questions about the accident that took your mother's life, questions that might change what we think we know." Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "Like what?" David took a deep breath, his voice steady. "Like whether the body buried in your mother's grave is actually hers." For a moment, silence enveloped the room, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of realization. Emily blinked rapidly, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What do you mean? How could it not be Mommy?" George felt a lump in his throat, the enormity of the truth crashing over him like a wave. "There was a mistake with the body identification tag at the morgue," he explained gently. "It's possible that something went wrong, and we're trying to find out if the body buried there belongs to someone else." Emily's expression turned from confusion to disbelief, her voice trembling. But I saw the grave. I helped put flowers there. I talked to her." "I know," George replied, his heart aching for the little girl. "And you still can. Love doesn't disappear, Emily, but we want to uncover the truth for you, for all of us." She stared down at the floor, her small shoulders shaking as she processed the information. "This is too much," she finally whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't want to believe it." David reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We understand, sweetheart. We're here for you no matter what. This is about finding closure and understanding what really happened." Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice small but resolute. "I want to know. I need to know." George felt a surge of admiration for her bravery. "Then we'll find out together," he promised. "You don't have to go through this alone." As they sat together, the weight of their shared loss hung in the air, but in that moment, a flicker of hope ignited within George. Perhaps this journey would not only lead them to answers, but also forge unbreakable bonds between them, a family of sorts born from the ashes of their grief. "Let's make a plan," David said, his voice regaining its strength. "We'll talk to Henry again and see if he can get us access to the morgue records. We need to uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it may be." George nodded, determination flooding through him. "Together we'll face whatever comes our way, for Michael, for Emily's mother, and for each other." As they discussed their next steps, Emily listened intently, the shadows of uncertainty beginning to lift. In the face of heartache, they had found solace in community, a shared purpose propelling them forward. With each word spoken, George felt the threads of their lives intertwining, weaving a tapestry of resilience, hope, and love. This was just the beginning, a journey that would lead them down a path of discovery, healing, and ultimately acceptance. They would confront the past, unearth the truth, and perhaps in the process, learn to live again. The morning light filtered through the curtains of George's living room, casting a soft glow over the worn furniture and photographs that adorned the walls. The air was thick with anticipation as George sat at the kitchen table, his fingers nervously tapping on the surface. David and Emily had spent the night at the Thompson house, and they had agreed to meet here to discuss their next steps. Each tick of the clock felt like an echo of their collective anxiety. George glanced out the window, watching the leaves dance in the gentle breeze. It was a beautiful day, yet he felt a heaviness in his chest, an ominous feeling that the truth they sought could lead to pain. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We're in this together," he reminded himself, a mantra he hoped would quell the rising tide of fear. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. George rose, his heart racing as he opened the door to find David and Emily standing there. Emily clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, her eyes a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Morning, George," David said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," George replied, forcing a smile as he stepped aside to let them in. "Come in. I've made some coffee." Emily wandered over to the table, her small fingers brushing against the petals of the daisies George had brought for Michael's grave. "Will we find out about my mom today?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. George knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "We're going to do everything we can to find out, Emily. But remember, whatever we discover, you have us with you. We'll face it together." David poured himself a cup of coffee, his expression thoughtful. "We should plan how we're going to approach Henry. He's the key to getting access to the morgue records, and we need to make sure we ask the right questions." As they settled around the table, George felt a sense of camaraderie forming among them. They were no longer just grieving individuals. They were a team, united in their quest for the truth. "We should start by asking about the missing identification tag," George suggested. "If we can get confirmation that it was lost, that gives us a solid foundation to work from. And we need to ask about the protocols in place for handling bodies," David added. "If there was a mistake, we need to understand how it happened." Emily looked between the two men, her small hands fidgeting. "What if it's really not my mom?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. George reached out, gently squeezing her shoulder. "We won't know until we ask. And no matter what, you're still the same Emily. Your mom loved you, and that will never change." After finishing their coffee, they gathered their things and set out for the cemetery office. The streets of Maplewood seemed particularly quiet that day, the usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves drowned out by the weight of their mission. George's heart raced with each step as they approached the office, the familiar building looming ahead like a sentinel guarding the secrets of the past. When they entered, Henry was already waiting, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You're here early," he remarked, gesturing for them to sit. "I've been thinking about our conversation. It's not a simple matter we're diving into." David nodded, the tension evident in his posture. "We're ready to do whatever it takes to uncover the truth. We need to know about the morgue records and the missing identification tag. Henry leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing as he considered their request. I can help you access the records, but I need to warn you. The process may not be straightforward. There could be legal hurdles, and not everyone will be willing to cooperate. Whatever it takes, George said, determination fueling his words. We owe it to Emily and to ourselves. Henry sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. All right, I'll make some calls. It might take a few days to get everything in order. He paused, his gaze shifting to Emily. I can't promise it won't be painful, but I will do my best to help you. Emily sat quietly, her small hands clasped together in her lap. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to know. Henry nodded, his expression softening. It's a difficult journey, but you're not alone. If you need support, I can recommend a counselor who specializes in grief. It might help to talk to someone about what you're feeling. George exchanged a glance with David, both men understanding the importance of addressing Emily's emotional needs. We'll consider it, David replied, his voice steady. But right now we want to focus on finding the truth. As Henry made his calls, George and David took the opportunity to discuss their next steps. They brainstormed questions and potential scenarios, preparing themselves for the challenges ahead. Emily listened intently, her expression shifting from anxiety to a quiet determination. After what felt like an eternity, Henry returned to the table, a stack of papers in hand. I've secured access to the morgue records, he said, placing the documents in front of George and David. But I'll need your word that you'll tread carefully. This isn't just about uncovering the truth, it's about the families involved. Of course, David said, his voice firm. We understand the sensitivity of the situation. As they began to sift through the pages, George's heart raced. The records were dense and filled with technical jargon, but at the same time, they held the potential for answers. Look for anything related to the identification tag, he instructed, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. The room was filled with a heavy silence as they read through the documents. Emily fidgeted in her seat, her eyes darting nervously between the adults. What does it say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. George looked up, meeting her gaze. We're still looking, Emily. Just a little longer. Minutes turned into hours as they combed through the records. Finally, David's voice broke through the tension. Here, there's a note about a missing identification tag. It was flagged during the review but never resolved. George felt a rush of adrenaline. This is it. We need to find out why it was never resolved. What happened next? Henry leaned closer, studying the document. This could lead us to the coroner's office. There might be additional records that can shed more light on the situation. As they gathered their things, a sense of urgency propelled them forward. The truth was within reach, but with it came the realization that they might uncover something far more painful than they had anticipated. George's heart raced, torn between hope and dread. Let's go to the coroner's office, David said, determination etched on his face. We need to find out what really happened. As they stepped out into the daylight, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were on the brink of something monumental, a truth waiting to be uncovered. Together, they would confront the unknown, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone in their grief. They were a family bound by love, loss, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The drive to the coroner's office felt like an eternity. George, David, and Emily sat in tense silence, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The streets of Maplewood passed by in a blur, but to George, time felt suspended. He was acutely aware of Emily's small form in the back seat, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. He wished he could shield her from the harsh realities they were about to confront, but he knew that the truth was a necessary burden for them all. As they pulled up to the coroner's office, a modest building that blended into the landscape of the small town, George felt his heart race. He glanced at David, who wore a mask of resolve, and then at Emily, who was trying to appear brave, but couldn't suppress the tremor in her hands. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" David asked gently, his voice steady. Emily took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to the building ahead. "I want to know," she replied, her determination evident despite her youth. "I need to know." George nodded, a surge of pride for the little girl swelling within him. "We all need to know," he affirmed, his voice firm. "Let's do this together." They stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the air thick with anticipation. The coroner's office was quiet, the only sound being the soft rustle of papers and the distant hum of machinery. George felt a chill run down his spine as they entered, the sterile environment starkly contrasting with the warmth and life they had just left outside. "Can I help you?" a receptionist asked, looking up from her desk with an air of professionalism. "We're here to see the coroner," David replied, his voice steady. "We have some questions about the records from the accident involving Emily's mother." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, concern flickering in her eyes. "Please have a seat. I'll inform Dr. Mitchell that you're here." She gestured toward a row of chairs, and they settled in, the silence wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. George's mind raced as he considered what lay ahead. The truth could bring closure, or it could shatter everything they had built since meeting in the cemetery. He glanced at Emily, who was fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, and felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, and a tall woman with dark hair and a serious expression walked in. "Hello, I'm Dr. Mitchell," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I understand you have questions regarding the accident that claimed Emily's mother." "Yes, thank you for meeting with us," David replied, shaking her hand. "We're trying to understand more about the body identification process and the missing identification tag." Dr. Mitchell nodded, her gaze shifting to Emily. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Emily. I can only imagine how difficult this has been for you." Emily offered a small, brave smile, but George could see the flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "Let's discuss your concerns," Dr. Mitchell said, leading them to a small conference room. The walls were lined with photographs of various cases, stark reminders of the fragility of life. They took their seats, and George felt the tension crackle in the air. "Regarding the accident," Dr. Mitchell began, her tone professional but empathetic. "The night in question was indeed foggy, which contributed to the confusion surrounding the identification of the deceased. When Emily's mother was brought to the morgue, there was a mix-up due to the missing identification tag." "What exactly happened?" George pressed, his heart racing as he leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell sighed, her expression serious. "The protocol for handling bodies is quite strict. When a body arrives, it should be tagged immediately. Unfortunately, in this case, the tag was misplaced, and the team was unable to confirm the identity until later. By then, arrangements had already begun to be made for burial." David's fists clenched in frustration. "So you're saying that the body buried in Emily's mother's grave might not be hers?" Dr. Mitchell nodded, her brow furrowing. "It's a possibility. The lack of an identification tag means that there's a gap in the records. I can't definitively say what went wrong, but I can provide you with the morgue records we have." "Thank you," George said, his voice tight with emotion. "We need to see them." Dr. Mitchell stood and retrieved a folder from a nearby cabinet, returning to place it on the table. These documents contain the details of the case, including autopsy reports and notes from the attending staff. I urge you to review them carefully, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask." As George opened the folder, he felt a mix of dread and hope wash over him. The pages were filled with technical jargon, but he could see the words "missing identification tag" highlighted in bold. He felt David lean closer, both of them scanning the documents for any clue that might lead them to the truth. "Here," David said, pointing to a passage. "It says the body was identified by a witness, but doesn't provide any details about who that witness was." "Do you have any idea who that could be?" George asked Dr. Mitchell, his heart racing. "Could you help us find out?" "I can look into it," Dr. Mitchell replied thoughtfully. "But please understand that this may take some time. Witnesses can be difficult to track down, especially if they were only present at the scene for a brief moment. Anything you can do would help," David insisted, the urgency in his voice palpable. "Emily deserves to know the truth." Dr. Mitchell nodded, her expression softening. "I'll do my best. But I must caution you, This journey may uncover painful truths that could change everything you believe. George exchanged a glance with David, both of them understanding the weight of her words. "We're prepared for whatever it takes," George affirmed, his voice steady. Emily, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, finally spoke up. "I want to know," she said, her voice strong. "I need to know if Mommy is really there." Dr. Mitchell's gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of their shared grief hung in the air. "Then let's do this together," she said, her tone resolute. After gathering the necessary information and exchanging contact details, they left the coroner's office, the sun shining brightly overhead. The warmth felt like a stark contrast to the heaviness in their hearts. As they drove back toward Maplewood, George felt a sense of urgency building within him. They were on the brink of uncovering a truth that had the potential to reshape their lives. But even as hope blossomed, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. What if the truth was more painful than they could imagine? "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together," David said, breaking the silence as if reading George's thoughts. "Yes," George agreed, determination filling his voice. "For Emily and for our own healing." As they pulled into the quiet streets of Maplewood, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they were no longer alone. Together, they were ready to confront whatever lay hidden beneath the surface, ready to face the truth and find solace in the love they shared. The shadows of the past were beginning to lift, and with each step they were moving closer to the light. The following days felt like an eternity as George, David, and Emily awaited news from Dr. Mitchell. Each passing hour was filled with a sense of urgency, the weight of their shared quest pressing heavily on their hearts. The more they waited, the more the uncertainty gnawed at them. But they remained resolute in their determination to uncover the truth about Emily's mother. Finally, the call came. George could hardly breathe as he answered, his heart racing in anticipation. "Mr. Sullivan?" Dr. Mitchell's voice came through the line, steady, yet laced with concern. "I have some information regarding the witness from the accident." "Please, what did you find?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The witness was a passerby who stopped to help at the scene. I've managed to track them down, and they agreed to meet with you, David and Emily. They have details that could clarify the situation surrounding the identification of the body." George felt a surge of hope intermixed with dread. "Where and when can we meet them?" "The local diner, Maplewood Cafe, tomorrow at noon," Dr. Mitchell replied. "I'll provide you with the contact details, and they'll be expecting you." After hanging up, George turned to David and Emily, who were sitting at the kitchen table, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Dr. Mitchell found the witness," George announced, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "We have a meeting set for tomorrow." Emily's eyes lit up with hope, but George could see the trepidation behind her excitement. "What if it's not good news?" she asked, her voice trembling. George knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "No matter what we find out, we're in this together. You're not alone, Emily. We'll face it as a family." David nodded, his expression resolute. "We're ready for whatever comes next. We owe it to Emily to uncover the truth." The next day arrived with a sense of urgency hanging in the air. As they made their way to the diner, George felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him, but he pushed it aside. They were on the brink of discovery, and he had to remain strong for Emily. The diner was bustling with activity as they entered, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filling the air. They spotted the witness, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, sitting in a booth at the back, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thompson, and Emily," the man greeted them with a warm smile. "I'm glad you could make it." "Thank you for meeting with us," David replied, gesturing for them to sit. "We appreciate your willingness to share what you know." The man nodded, his expression turning serious. "I was driving home that night. I saw the accident happen. It was so foggy, but I remember a car swerving and crashing." George leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What can you tell us about the identification process?" "I was one of the first to arrive at the scene," the man explained. "I helped pull the driver from the wreckage, but I didn't see who it was until the paramedics arrived. They asked me to identify the body, but I was in shock and I didn't get a good look." Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking within her. "So, "You didn't see my mom." The man shook his head gently. "I'm sorry, little one, I didn't. I was focused on helping anyone I could. I wish I could give you the answers you seek." George felt a chill run down his spine. "But you mentioned there was a mix-up. Could there have been a chance that the wrong body was identified?" "Yes," the man replied gravely. "With the chaos of the accident and the fog, it's possible there was confusion. I heard the medics say something about a missing identification tag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Do you remember anything else? Any details that might help us?" David pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. The man thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. "I remember a woman in a blue dress. She was at the scene, but I can't say for certain if it was Emily's mother. It all happened so fast." Emily's voice was small as she asked, "But if it wasn't my mommy, then who is in her grave?" George felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the implications of their conversation. "We're still trying to find out," he said gently, squeezing Emily's hand. "But this is an important step." The witness nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I'm truly sorry for what you're all going through. If there's anything else I can do to help, please let me know." After exchanging contact information, the three of them left the diner, the weight of uncertainty still hanging over them. Yet amid the fear and confusion, George felt a flicker of hope. They were closer to the truth than ever before. In the days that followed, they continued to work with Dr. Mitchell to investigate further. They learned about the protocols for handling bodies and began to piece together the fragments of the past. It was a tumultuous journey, filled with moments of heartbreak and revelation, but they pressed on for Emily's sake. Finally, the day arrived when they would confront the truth once and for all. They gathered in the cemetery, where the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the graves. George stood before Michael's resting place, feeling the familiar ache in his heart. "I hope you're watching over us, son. We're about to uncover the truth." David, Emily, and Henry joined him, their expressions a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "Are you ready?" David asked, looking down at Emily. She nodded, her determination shining through her fear. "I want to know." Henry cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We've managed to retrieve the additional records, including DNA samples collected from the bodies involved in the accident. The results will confirm the identities of those buried." As they gathered around the new grave, George felt the gravity of the moment settle over them. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We're about to learn the truth." They waited in silence as Henry opened the results, his brow furrowing as he read through the findings. The DNA results indicate that the body buried in Emily's mother's grave does not match her DNA. "We have confirmation." Emily gasped, her hands clutching David's arm. "So it wasn't her?" Henry nodded solemnly. "I'm deeply sorry, Emily. It appears that there was indeed a mix-up. The body identified as your mother was not hers." George felt a wave of emotions crash over him, relief, sadness, and a profound sense of loss. "But where is she?" he asked, his voice thick with anguish. "We're working to locate the body that matches the DNA evidence," Henry explained. "Once we've confirmed its identity, we can give your family the closure you all deserve." As the weight of the truth settled in, George turned to Emily, who looked both devastated and relieved. "You deserve to know the truth, Emily," he whispered. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." In the days that followed, George, David, and Emily worked tirelessly with Henry and Dr. Mitchell to ensure that the truth was honored. They arranged for a dignified burial for Emily's mother, a ceremony that would allow her to finally rest in peace. As they stood together on the day of the burial, George felt a sense of healing begin to wash over him. Emily, dressed in a simple white dress, stood beside him, her small hand clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. David stood on seu lado, seu olhar firme e protetor. "We're finally saying goodbye," Emily said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "But I feel like I can finally move on." George knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. "You're not alone, Emily. You have us, and you always will." As they lowered the casket into the ground, a sense of closure enveloped them. They had faced the darkness of their past, confronted the unknown, and emerged stronger on the other side. It was a bittersweet moment, but in their hearts, they felt a flicker of hope, a promise of new beginnings. In the weeks that followed, George, David, and Emily formed a bond that transcended their shared grief. They became a family, each of them finding solace in the love and support they offered one another. The shadows of the past began to lift, and together they forged a new path, one filled with laughter, memories, and the promise of brighter days ahead. As for the antagonists in their story, the circumstances that led to the tragic mix-up, those responsible faced scrutiny and accountability. The community rallied around George, David, and Emily, demanding justice for the families affected by the tragedy. In Maplewood, the cemetery stood as a reminder of the fragility of life, but it also became a symbol of hope and renewal. As George visited Michael's grave, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. His son would forever be a part of his life, guiding him as he embraced the love of a newfound family. "Thank you for watching over us, Michael," George whispered, placing a bouquet of daisies at his son's grave. "We'll be all right." And as he turned to walk away, he felt the warmth of the sun on his back, a promise of new beginnings and the strength of love that transcends loss. Together, George, David, and Emily would continue their journey, knowing that while the past may leave its scars, it is the love, resilience, and bonds they forged along the way that would carry them forward into a future full of hope and healing. In the end, the cemetery became not only a place of mourning but also one of remembrance and connection, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, new relationships and renewed purpose can bloom. And as George walked with his newfound family, he knew they had turned a page, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the light of a new chapter. What did you think of the story? Please leave your thoughts in the comments.